Your stories.
Your freedom.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Welcome, everybody. This is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com. We're broadcasting live from the Euro-Pacific Canada office here in Toronto, Canada. I will be here for the next 3 days speaking at an event which apparently is sold out. I've got some people who have emailed us how do they get tickets to the event in Montreal on Thursday. We might be able to scrounge up a couple of tickets, but apparently they're tough to come by. But I just got in last night and had one meeting earlier this morning, and I just made it back to the offices to do the show. We will be taking phone calls as normal at 855-4-SCHIFF. Unfortunately, those of you who normally watch the video feed, there is no video today or tomorrow. We didn't have that equipment with us, but we do have audio. And on Thursday, again, Thomas Woods will be the guest host, and he will be joined by Judge Napolitano. So make sure and tune in for Thursday's show, as well as my shows on Wednesday. Let's look at the markets really quickly. You know, it's a mirror image of yesterday, although the direction, not necessarily the magnitude. Dow Jones is down about 60 points. Stocks are down, as are commodities. Oil is down 50 cents. Gold down about $14. Silver down. The dollar up. Again, everything the opposite of what happened yesterday, only on a smaller scale. The dollar not up nearly as much as it was down yesterday. Stocks not down nearly as much as they were up. The bond market is resuming trading, and as I said, the bond market is selling off, although I think it would be selling off even more if the stock market were rising today, although the yield on the 10-year is now back up to 2.15%, which still may seem very low and is very low, but it is not nearly as low as the 1.7 that we were trading at, I believe, early last week. So we are getting some weakness into the bond market. You know, looking at the stories overnight, probably one of the most interesting ones coming out of Singapore, the headline on the Bloomberg story is Singapore to slow currency climb to aid growth. So in other words, they want to weaken their currency because they think that will support economic growth, when it's actually the reverse. But here we have another country that has a strong currency thinking that the solution to growth is to weaken the currency, even though Singapore has among the fastest growth rates in the world, thanks in no small part to the fact that they have one of the strongest currencies in the world. But the government is saying that they are going to try to suppress the strength of their currency, which is a foolish thing to do, especially if you look at the inflation rate is accelerating. Consumer price increases are now rising at their fastest pace since October of 2008. CPI is rising at 5.7%. Now, historically, Singapore inflation is among the lowest in the world, 1% to 2% a year consistently. Yet now we have inflation running at 5.7%, and the Singapore government says that they need to ease monetary policy. This is showing you how the U.S. dollar is screwing up a global monetary policy that a country like Singapore thinks that they need to ease, despite the fact that inflation is high and rising. What they should do is let their currency rise even faster. See, the problem is, even though the Singapore dollar has been strong, it has not been strong enough. They have had to print a lot of Singapore dollars in order to prevent the currency from rising to a natural level, and the result is that prices are rising when in fact they could be stable or falling. And so the Singapore government is making the same mistake as the Swiss government, as many governments, and this is evidence of really the unraveling of this monetary system with the dollar as the reserve currency. That being said, you know, I still like the Singapore dollar long term. It's still one of my favorite currencies, as is the Swiss franc, despite these temporary obstacles where their own governments are seeking to undermine the strength of their currencies. It will only backfire and cause more inflation, and ultimately, I believe, cause the governments to abandon these foolish policies. But in the meantime, that's another reason for the people in Singapore to buy gold, just like the people in Switzerland. So as more governments seek to undermine their own currency because they feel foolishly that the currency should not be allowed to rise too much against the dollar, well, that simply makes gold more appealing to another group of people that are going to see monetary policy undermining the value of their currency. Speaking about people's purchasing power being undermined, there's a story out today about the fact that income for Americans has actually declined by a faster pace since the recession ended than during the period of the recession. If you look at the time period, the official time period for the Great Recession, it began in December of 2007 and officially ended in June of 2009, so not quite 2 full years. But during that period of time, household income adjusted for inflation. Of course, this is adjusted for the government's version of inflation, so the real decline is actually greater. But according to the government, real incomes fell by 3.2% during the time period of the recession. During the time period since then, the recovery from June of 2009 through the present, household income adjusted for inflation dropped by 6.7%. So let's get this straight. Americans are faring worse during the recovery than they did during the recession. Well, then how is that a recovery? If incomes are dropping more during the recovery than during the recession, wouldn't that be more evidence that the recovery hasn't actually started yet? How do you have a recovery when incomes are not recovering, when they're still contracting? I think really what this shows is that the recovery is not even real. It's phony, because it's easier to fake economic growth than income growth, because the incomes are what they are. But the GDP numbers are a concoction of government statisticians, hedonics, and all the different ways that they calculate the GDP. Of course, now the GDP is still deflated by a phony deflator, but that would also apply to personal income. So I think the inflation adjustments maybe are not the explanation, but I do think that a lot of what goes into GDP is not really indicative of a growing economy. I think if the economy were growing, incomes would not be falling. I mean, how is it possible that the economy is richer as all the people in the economy are collectively poor? Doesn't make any sense. And I think if you look at the lack of employment, when people are calling this a jobless recovery, well, maybe it's jobless because it's not a recovery. Certainly the personal income numbers would suggest that the economy is not recovering. In fact, maybe it is contracting faster than it was during the official period of the recession. And if you look at the population, why so many people in the polls, we do a lot of polls now because of the presidential race, and so many people feel that the country is headed in the wrong direction. Maybe that's because we're still in recession. Maybe the recession never ended, which makes a lot more sense given the numbers, given the income data, given the employment data, given what's happened in the markets. I think the anecdotal evidence suggests that the recession did, in fact, not end. In fact, I believe that we are still early in a depression. Anyway, we'll be back in a few minutes. We'll be taking your calls here on SchiffRadio.com, so stick around.
The Peter Schiff Show. Since the Peter Schiff Show was last on the air, the national debt added another $7.89 million. Luckily, Peter's intelligence is growing twice as fast.
That's incredible.
Welcome back to your source of sanity in an insane world. It's the Peter Schiff Show.
And this is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com, broadcasting live from the Europac Canada offices in Toronto, Canada. A lot of attention continued to be focused and building on the Occupy Wall Street movement, growing now, occupying various cities around the country. But, my question is, what is the movement really all about? Is it really as socialistic or anti-capitalistic as the media would portray it? Because it seems to me that you've got really a mixture of protesters. In fact, many of the people who are protesting capitalism, whether they know it or not, are not actually protesting capitalism. They're protesting crony capitalism. They're protesting socialism. They just don't understand it. And what somebody really needs to do is educate a lot of these individuals so that they understand the real source of our problems. And this is something that I was warning about and afraid would happen as a result of the backlash that I thought would come to all the Wall Street bailouts, that the government was discrediting capitalism and giving capitalism a bad name based on the way we were supposedly practicing it. I've said this many, many times, that China gives communism a good name and America gives capitalism a bad name. You know, I was watching a YouTube video from a protester down on Occupy Wall Street who was calling himself Captain Midnight. And this kid is, is a libertarian. He's an Austrian schooled, educated. He believes in sound money, believes in the Constitution, believes in limited government. And he's out there, marching with the protesters on Occupy Wall Street. So obviously a very different spin. This guy does not want to empower government. He wants to dismantle much of the government. He wants to empower individuals and, private initiative, entrepreneurship. He certainly objects to what's happening in the banks and with Wall Street, but not because he objects to capitalism. It's because he's in favor of capitalism, and he understands that what we have now, the partnership and the relationship between Washington and the banks, is not capitalism. And so not everybody is, a Marxist demanding, redistribution of wealth. And, obviously the list of demands that I read of the Occupied Wall Street movement, obviously Captain Midnight is not adhering to any of those demands. So it'd be interesting to actually find out the breakdown of the people who are participating in these protests, exactly what it is they're protesting and why, and what their proposed solutions are. Because there could be a pretty big variance of opinions and ideologies down there. But I wanted to play some sound from some interviews from just a 12-year-old kid who's marching. I guess he's there with his parents. He's a 7th grader, so we're playing a lot of sound from the youngsters, the 2nd graders, the 5th graders. Here we got a 7th grader who's chiming in, and he is speaking to a CNBC reporter, explaining exactly why he is there and what he is protesting. So let's listen in. It's cut number 1.
Yes, I'm 12 years old. I'm in 7th grade. I'm from Montclair, and I'm here to protest corporate America, protest bank bailouts, protest the fact that 97% of this country's wealth is controlled in 3% of the population. I am here to protest the fact that we have spent over $500 billion on corporate bailouts in the last 10 years. If we got all the money back that the corporations have taken from the United States government, we would erase about half of our national deficit, meaning that basically corporations are the reason we are, no longer a AAA country.
Well, it sounds like a pretty well-rehearsed presentation there. He got a lot of his facts wrong, but you can see that what is inspiring the protest, at least in this young man's mind, and maybe he's got some help from his dad, is the corporate bailouts. Well, bailouts are not a part of capitalism. Under capitalism, corporations that are bankrupt are allowed to fail. So anybody who is protesting bank bailouts or corporate bailouts is supporting capitalism. They are protesting the government's interference and not letting capitalism work. Capitalism is about private profits and private losses, not socialized losses. It is survival of the fittest, and if you're not fit, you perish. And that's what many of these corporations and banks should have done, but they did not because of socialism, because the government bailed them out and socialized the losses. Don't protest the corporations for taking government money. After all, if the government's willing to hand you money, anybody is going to take it, right? Anybody is going to take money. Look, if the government came to me and offered to give me a bunch of money, I'm not going to turn it down. Why would I turn it down? Of course I'm going to take it. But you wouldn't blame me for taking the money. The problem would be the government for offering it to me in the first place. That is the problem. Everybody is going to take a handout if it's offered to them from the government. And plus, if the government was offering me a handout and I didn't take it, well, they just give it to somebody else. So just assume give it to me, then give it to somebody else. But the problem is not the fault of the private company or private citizen for accepting what the government is giving him. The problem is the government turning it over in the first place. Let's play a little bit more from this 12-year-old. This cut number 2.
I'm here to protest the fact that corporations care about themselves. They don't care about America. They care about their own pockets. They don't care about anything else. What they care about is making money. And here's the thing. The American dream is to make money, but not to keep other Americans from being able to do anything. We need to be here for our country, not for everything else. We are in trouble because of these banks. We need them to help us get out. We need them to stop being greed. I mean, come on. It's not good. It's not good.
See, he gets it half right. He says the problem is that the banks are just trying to make money and they're greedy. But then he says, but wait a minute, that's the American dream, to make money. So he's kind of like doesn't understand the contradiction. What's going on? Yes, we want people to make money, but we don't want them to be greedy. You see, what he really doesn't want is he wants people to make money without help from the government. You see, when an entrepreneur makes money based on his greed, he doesn't take money from somebody else in the process. He has to be given money. Customers have to voluntarily spend their money. And so if somebody makes money in the private sector, in a market-based economy, his greed is not a danger to society, because the only way he can enrich himself is if he benefits society. He has to earn business by providing products or services of a higher quality at a lower cost than his competitors. That's how greed is turned into profits in the free market. See, the problem is the banks are making money based on government handouts, based on free money from the Fed. So bank greed is actually hurting the U.S. economy, not because of capitalism, but because of socialism, because the government is an instrument for the banks to be able to make money at the expense of the country. Now, this kid maybe is smart enough to sense that, but he doesn't understand what is actually behind the dynamic. It is the government. The anger should not be at the banks. The anger needs to be at the government that is enabling and funding the banks and making this whole system possible. So in order to reform it, we need to go to Washington. Wall Street, protesting Wall Street is going to do nothing. It's Washington, it's the Fed, it's Congress, it's the White House. That's where all this anger and frustration needs to be focused. Anyway, we're going to be back. I've got a great guest coming up, a Senate candidate and a Republican Senate candidate. So stick around. We'll be right back. You're listening to the Peter Schiff Show on SchiffRadio.com.
The Peter Schiff Show. We now return to the Peter Schiff Show. Call in now, 855-4-SCHIFF. That's 855-472-4433. Rebel Radio, the Peter Schiff Show.
This is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com. And joining me now is my guest, Republican U.S. Senate candidate Richard Murdoch, who is running in a primary against incumbent Republican Richard Lugar, which, of course, I think is reason enough to vote for Richard Murdoch. I mean, I pretty much would like to vote against any incumbent. I'm a pretty big believer in term limits, and since nobody in Congress will vote for them, the one way to get them is not to reelect anybody. But Richard is the Indiana State Treasurer. He was first elected in 2006, reelected in 2010 with 62% of the vote. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Peter. Great to be with you. And I'm fully on board on that term limit thing. We've got to start limiting the terms that people can serve.
Sure. And you haven't been in the state government very long, right? You spent most of your career earning a living legitimately in the private sector, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I actually spent 31 years in the private sector. I'm as unlikely as it may seem for a state treasurer. I'm actually a geologist. And it's been 31 years in the energy business, and I've been a full-time government official now for barely 5 years, and certainly that experience is less important to me than all that.
Well, I think that's good experience for it being in the investment business these days, because I think a good geologist, a lot of the best opportunities are in natural resources and minerals and things like that. So having your background is probably helping you get a good return on the money that you're overseeing there in Indiana. But on Dick Lugar, how much time has Dick Lugar spent in the private sector?
I don't know that he spent any full time at all in the private sector. He's been in the United States Senate. He's for 36 years. Prior to that, he was the mayor here in Indianapolis, and it's quite a different resume than the one I'm offering the folks of Indiana.
Yeah, his name, Dick Lugar, that name has been around for a long time. How old was I when he was not in the Senate? I'm 48, so he's been 36. I was 12 years old. He's been in the Senate pretty much my entire adult life.
And here in Indiana, the way I like to make that point is that when Dick Lugar first started running for the U.S. Senate, Peyton Manning was a gleam in Archie's eye. So he has been there quite some time.
Yeah, we were probably still a creditor nation back then. We were a much sounder economy. After 36 years of a Dick Lugar Senate, look at the disaster that has become of our nation. So.
Well, I'm often tempted to use that Ronald Reagan quote, change it just a bit. Are we better off now than we were 35 years ago? When we look at the world, it is such a different place. And in all seriousness, Dick Lugar is an honorable person. He has served this state very well. He's served the nation well. But as we go into the 21st century now, the time is so different. As you made reference a moment ago, Peter, the economic situation, the financial world of the last 5 years has been a post-PhD level of learning for anyone who's been paying attention solely on that issue. And if we don't change our economic status in this next couple of years, we're done as a nation.
Yeah.
And we
people who have spent a lifetime in government are not going to solve the problems that government have created. They're too involved in it. They're too close to the problem to even understand their role in it. And so, the only way we're going to solve these problems is to clean house and bring private sector experience into Washington, bring people to Washington who have operated under the rules and the regulations that Congress has been writing. They understand their destructive nature, and they know what needs to be done in order to unleash the capitalist economy that built this country in the first place. And unfortunately, they have been undermining it from Washington. But, you have a very interesting story as a state treasurer, because you I think, took the lead nationally in suing over the illegal bailout of Chrysler and the way that phony, that sham bankruptcy went through, where the bondholders were pretty much screwed. And you owned bonds of Chrysler in your pension, for the benefit of state employees. Tell me a little bit about how that went down and what you did to try to protect the legal rights of Indiana state employees.
Sure, and let me begin by saying if anyone had told me 6 years ago when I sought this office that I would end up being the sole petitioner in a case to the U.S. Supreme Court twice, and because of that be called to 2 congressional committees to testify, I probably would have looked for something else to do. But you set it up exactly right. We had the secured debt in Chrysler Corporation through several state pension funds. The process that the federal government used, there was no basis in law for whatsoever. They picked winners and losers arbitrarily, said that our pensioners were losers, and certain non-secured creditors, principally United Auto Workers, were going to be the winners.
Now, what were your bonds secured by?
Well, we had secured credit as any secured creditor did. I mean, we were secured with the assets of the corporation, first in line. And when we received notice from the bankruptcy court that we were getting 29 cents on the dollar, imagine this, Peter. We received a certified letter at 10:05 a.m. on May 18th of 2009 telling us we were getting 29 cents. But the way the legal process was going to work, they were going to give us the right to challenge that. And for us to challenge, we had to provide evidence of all of our trade tickets, affidavits from everyone who was involved in valuing the purchase of that debt, deposition of anyone we consider to be an expert witness, and a thorough and complete financial analysis of Chrysler Corporation and its subsidiaries, and we had to have all that information on file in the Bankruptcy Court of New York by 4 o'clock the next afternoon. The process was absolutely rigged against any normal interpretation of American bankruptcy law. It was just thrown away so that the government could pick winners and losers, and that is fundamentally un-American.
Well, when you're, I don't know if you were around when those bonds were originally purchased, but I'm sure that the only reason that those bonds were purchased was because you felt that there was enough collateral behind them that even if Chrysler were to go bankrupt, which I think was a distinct possibility. In fact, I had been forecasting the bankruptcy of these auto companies for years, but I'm sure you probably felt comfortable that even if there was a bankruptcy, there was sufficient collateral behind those bonds in the form of real assets that you felt secure in lending money to Chrysler.
Absolutely right. In fact, number one, we bought the bonds at a discount. We bought them at 43 cents on the dollar, and the time they were purchased, by the way, was in July of 2008, when gasoline was over $4 a gallon. By the way, we have over 6,000 Chrysler employees here in the state of Indiana, and when I would not back down on the lawsuit, believe me, I heard from every one of them who were very upset with me over the fact that they thought somehow I was going to take their job away when it was we had nothing to do with putting them in bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. But even more to the point, the valuation decision that was done in our purchase was based on financial reports that Chrysler had made in the previous 6 months, where they said they had something like $25 billion in assets, and there were only $6.9 billion outstanding of secured debt. So we certainly felt comfortable with what we were doing. We were trying to be a part and party to their success, and never imagined that the federal government would pull the rug out from underneath the whole legal process. And if I could share one other thing with you, too. During one of the testimonies that I gave to the Troubled Asset Recovery Program, the Congressional Oversight Panel, it was chaired by Elizabeth Warren, who is now running for the U.S. Senate, ironically, in the state of Massachusetts. She said during the testimony, when she was firing questions at me, that I should have known I hadn't bought secured debt because I bought it at a discount. Which begs the question, what about the people who paid 100 cents on the dollar for it? Didn't they think they had bought secured debt? And, of course, they got 29 cents on the dollar, just like we did. I mean, this is the level of financial understanding and commitment to the law.
Now, how has that changed? Now, how has that changed your investment decisions? Would you ever buy bonds again of a U.S. corporation, let's say, that had a big union representation?
You hit the nail right on the head. No, we changed our investment policies, and when our actions in Indiana first started to show up on the national radar screen was actually before we filed in the bankruptcy case, because we had announced, and I did an interview with the Wall Street Journal, that we were changing our investment strategies, that we would no longer buy secured debt of corporations that had large union workforces, heavily capitalized, and obviously red ink on the balance sheet in any way, because it was clear the government was going to pick winners and losers, and they were going to do whatever they wanted to do, however they wanted to do it. And when you looked across the heavy manufacturing, the chemical industries, steel making in the United States, I mean, there's still some of those corporations that have to be looked at very closely from the spectrum of trying to invest from public funds.
Right, and so what happens is you now have a moral hazard by basically abrogating the rule of law, by depriving you of property and just giving it to a political class for political reasons. Now, how much more difficult is it going to be for American companies to access the capital markets when people won't loan them money because they can't count on any legal protections in our courts?
Well, not only that, but, I had someone from Wall Street say to me just last month that they think a lot of the reasons why we are still in the economic slowdown is because of what happened in Chrysler, and about 3 weeks later, General Motors, who was largely on the same path, that it so undermined the basic rule of law that people are hesitant to get involved.
Yeah, and the president...
Let me just finish. And ironically, and this is what most people don't understand, and I'm not a lawyer, so I didn't know that only in American law can you lose the battle and yet win the greater war. 6 months after the bankruptcy took place and the bondholders were ripped off, the United States Supreme Court took our case, ruled from the bench, and struck down all of the legal practice that the Second Circuit had applied in making the bankruptcy occur the way it did. So the precedent of law that appeared to be there that said secured creditors could lose their rights has now been erased because, frankly, I stuck to my guns and we've continued to pursue the case.
But did you get your money back?
No, because there was no venue by which we could get our money back by that time. So that's why I say we lost the battle, but we won the greater war, which is to say the word secured credit still has the traditional, now again historical meaning.
But I wonder if that decision will be binding if this were to happen again. I mean, would the government be bound by that Supreme Court decision, or could they once again just steal money, give it to the unions, and wait for somebody to petition the Supreme Court with another hollow victory?
Well,
we'll have to hold off, and I'll get your response when we come back from the break. You're listening to the Peter Schiff Show here at SchiffRadio.com.
The Peter Schiff Show. To President Obama, Secretary Geithner, Madam Pelosi, and all of the socialist econ professors across America, we're sorry. We're sorry. Peter Schiff is back on the air.
And this is Peter Schiff. I am speaking with Republican Senate candidate in the state of Indiana, Richard Murdoch. And before the break, Richard, I'd asked you if you thought that your hollow Supreme Court victory, or at least hollow maybe in your sense, but maybe not in the national sense, is that going to have a precedent? And, this is basically the Supreme Court officially saying that the Obama administration acted outside the law.
Well, that's a great question. And what the Supreme Court did was strike down the Second Circuit's decision in the case. So the precedent that others were claiming, just give me the Chrysler deal, let me throw away my secured creditors, and I'll start all over, that precedent has been erased. So there's no precedent existing today that anyone can claim. The bigger question is, if we have some level of crisis again, is it possible the United States Supreme Court could make it up on the fly, as they did in this case? And that always remains a possibility.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we no longer are a nation of laws. We are a nation of men, and that is a major, major step backwards for the United States. Often Obama tries to claim credit for saving the auto industry with these bailouts, as if had they not done the bailouts, the automobile companies would have completely shut down and there'd be nobody working in the automobile industry. What do you think would have happened had a traditional bankruptcy taken place? Do you think we would have a more vibrant automobile industry today, or do you think the bailouts resulted in an improved auto companies?
I think had they occurred under normal bankruptcy law, there certainly would have been some downsizing. I think various divisions, and I'm obviously involved with Chrysler more than General Motors, but I think the Dodge truck division, the pickup trucks, the vans that they make, by and large, they're still their most profitable area. I think that would still be going. Would there be a downsizing and reduction in the number of cars they offer? Yes, because the market wasn't demanding those types of cars. What, again, most people don't realize, the bailouts really haven't stopped. In June of this year, and your listeners will be fascinated by this one, part of the original bankruptcy deal was that if the company that took over Chrysler, Fiat, paid to the U.S. government $3.5 billion by the second anniversary of the deal, which was June 6th, then they would get a chance to buy additional stock at a discount. They paid $3.5 billion to the United States government in May of this year, just before the June 6th deadline. And then immediately after the June 6th deadline, Stephen Chu, the Secretary of Energy, announced that the U.S. Department of Energy was getting ready to make a loan to Fiat, the Italian automaker. Take a guess for how much? $3.5 billion. And this is the parent company of Alfa Romeo, Maserati, and Ferrari that the U.S. government is now giving a low-interest loan to, which begs the question, in this interest rate environment, why is the government doing any low-interest loans as low as rates are? But this thing continues on and on.
Yeah, I think that had there been a more traditional bankruptcy, that what would have happened is some of the plants that are not profitable would have been purchased, and without the labor contracts and all the unemployed auto workers, that somebody could have figured out how to combine that capital with workers at a lower rate of pay, but at a wage that enabled a car to be manufactured that could be sold at a profit. And in fact, we might have a larger, more robust automobile industry today had the assets been allowed to be reallocated in a more efficient manner, and had we allowed labor costs to come down to more globally competitive rates rather than to simply try.
A distinct possibility. When I said some of the divisions that were out there, like the truck division, might have continued onward, that's exactly the scenario that I was painting, that I think someone else would have come in and picked up those several divisions that where there's real market demand. And by and large, that the union wages aren't as much the problem as it is the so-called feather bedding, where it takes 5 people to do the job of 3. I mean, that's the big difference between the Toyotas and the Hondas and their operations in the U.S. right now and the Chrysler and General Motor models. I mean, you would have seen a dramatic.
Yeah, well, all that is
would have come down.
Yeah, well, all that is part of the labor costs. Labor costs are too high if union rules mandate that you have 2 people do a job that only requires 1. You know, and of course, it's not just the labor unions; it's all sorts of government rules and regulations that are artificially driving up labor costs well beyond what is actually paid to the workers in wages. It's just all the compliance and regulatory costs that are added on top of that make it so expensive to make anything in America.
You're exactly right. And, you know, here in Indiana, we have a exceptionally large part of our economy is the manufacturing base. We're larger than the national average in that regard. And as many business folks as I talk to around this state, literally every day, I am just so frustrated in hearing of their frustrations on how that jackboot of federal government regulation is just standing on their necks right now. And again, the people in D.C. that have been there so many years who put the regulations in place, if anyone expects they're going to suddenly wake up in the morning and say, oh, let's unroll this thing, it's not going to happen. Now, I really encourage your listeners to go to richardmurdoch.com to check us out to see what our positions are on these issues. But
has Richard Murdoch done anything to take that federal boot off the necks of Indiana businessmen? Or
no, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry.
I said, has Senator Lugar done anything to try to take the federal boot off the necks of Indiana entrepreneurs?
Well, I certainly haven't seen any evidence of it lately. In fact, I've seen more and more the opposite. I mean, he's one of these folks who believes in kind of this green energy light stuff that's telling us what kind of light bulbs we have to have and how much insulation we need in our house and all those different regulations that somehow the federal government has seemed to come to believe as part of their role to tell us how to live our lives. I mean,
does he have any other opponents in a primary for the Senate seat?
No, it's just Mr. Lugar and myself. And by the way, 69% of all Republicans in a recent poll said they agreed with the statement that Senator Lugar's had a long and distinguished career, but they believe it's time for someone else. In at least one poll, we're leading head-to-head on a 34-32, and I'm very confident we're going to win this race because the Hoosiers are sick and tired of what's happening in D.C., and they recognize that the establishment isn't going to fix the problem.
Yeah, I think the public is getting fed up with Congress. The congressional approval is at an all-time record low. So I don't see how Dick Lugar can distance himself from that. He is certainly part of the problem. He is never going to be part of the solution. And I think we just need the voters to focus their anger and frustration where it belongs. You know, we're seeing a lot of protests now around the country, but the real source of the problem is emanating from Washington. And it's almost, no matter what you guys in Indiana do on a state level, it's just going to be undermined. Washington is just going to pull the rug out from under you. So we need to send people like yourself back to Washington and try to, put a brake on it and try to reverse some of these policies, because otherwise there is no recovery. I mean, we're just going to be in this depression in perpetuity.
That's right. There are far too many people referring to what we're in right now as the new norm. And that becomes somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we think this is as good as it's going to get, this is as good as it's going to get.
Hey, I got news for you. It's going to get a lot worse. We ain't seen nothing yet. That is the unfortunate. Where it's not the new normal. It's going to get a lot worse if we continue on this path. That's what's the real scary part. Anyway, Richard, thanks for coming on the show. I wish you well. Appreciate what you did in the courts. It might make a difference. If it didn't, at least in your case, maybe it will in the future. But unfortunately, I think private property rights have been compromised, and it'll be hard to regain the confidence of the markets. Anyway, thanks for coming on the show. Good luck in your Senate race. Everybody else will be back. We have another full hour coming up on the Peter Schiff Show here at SchiffRadio.com.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Make no friends in the pits and you take no prisoners. 1 minute you're up $500,000 in soybeans and the next, boom, your kids don't go to college and they've repossessed your Bentley. Are you with me?
The revolution starts now.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Turn those machines back on!
You are about to enter the Peter Schiff Show.
Show me the money!
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth.
The Peter Schiff Show is on. Call in now. 855-4-SCHIFF. That's 855-472-4433.
I don't know when they decided that they wanted to make a virtue out of selfishness.
Your money, your stories, your freedom. The Peter Schiff Show.
And this is Peter Schiff. The second hour of the Peter Schiff Show is underway now. We are taking your calls at 855-4-SCHIFF, 855-4-SCHIFF. A bit of a reversal in the markets. The Dow and the S&P have turned positive. Not the Dow, the NASDAQ and the S&P have now turned positive, erasing early morning declines. The Dow only down about 22 points right now. Precious metals still under pressure, other commodities down, and the dollar still rising, although off its early morning highs, but still in positive territory. The bond market, though, has continued under pressure. Bond prices made new lows, yields made new highs. So the yields are still very, very low historically, but we are at levels right now where you would expect, if these trends are going to stay in place, that the bond market should rally and stocks should sell off. If we get more of a rally here in the stock market and a fall in the bond prices, we could break through some key levels and be in for much bigger moves in the short run. Hey, before I go to the phones, I wanted to continue talking a little bit about the Occupy Wall Street movement and some of the people are expressing their anger in the wrong way, at the wrong direction. But again, this is exactly what I was afraid was going to happen, what I was writing was going to happen as a result of not only the financial crisis that the government created, but the bailouts that the government orchestrated in the aftermath of that crisis. All of this discrediting capitalism, even though capitalism has nothing to do with the problem. This was a government-created problem, and the government solutions made it worse, but they have done a lot to discredit capitalism, just like Herbert Hoover did a lot to discredit capitalism, despite the fact that his solution to the Depression was big government and the modern-day equivalent of bailouts and stimulus. He did everything he could to get the government involved, yet somehow history has rewritten that as if he was a laissez-faire capitalist, and the fact that the Depression grew on his watch is somehow an indictment of capitalism and the free market, even though capitalism and the free market were not tried during the Hoover administration. In fact, had Hoover relied on the free market, we would not have had a Great Depression. But this is similar. I want to go over a discussion that took place on Canadian television. Since I'm in Canada, figured that was appropriate. This is a New York Times reporter, Chris Hedges, who had been participating in the Occupy Wall Street protest, who was invited on CBC up here in Canada. And let's listen in on his discussion that begins with cut number 7.
So, Mr. Hedges, you were a participant in the protest. How would you describe your role in this movement?
I'm not an organizer. I'm speaking tonight at the rally in Washington, and I've given interviews and participated in events in New York.
All right, so that's kind of the setup. He's a participant. He's not an organizer, but he's a speaker. He's there. He's in Washington. He's in New York, so he's taking part. Anyway, here's cut number 8.
What is the sense you have of what this movement would like to see happen?
They know precisely what they want. They want to reverse the corporate coup that's taken place in the United States and render the citizenry impotent. And they won't stop until that happens. And frankly, if we don't break the back of corporations, we're all finished anyway, since they're rapidly trashing the ecosystem on which the human species depends for survival. This is literally a fight for life. It's that grave, it's that serious.
Well, he sounds like one of those environmental wackos, but he's, again, what is the corporate coup that he's talking about? When did the corporations commit the equivalent of a coup d'etat and take over the country, the government? Well, what he's talking about is corporate bailouts. But who did the bailing? It was the government. If you are upset at corporate bailouts, why isn't your anger directed at the government that bailed them out, not at the corporations? As I said, it's only human nature, or in this case, corporate nature, to ask for a bailout. It's up to a good government to refuse it. So protesting corporations because you're upset that some were bailed out makes no sense. You've got to protest the government. But I suppose that doesn't jive with this particular guy's agenda, which is socialist anyway, and he's trying to use this movement to further his own agenda, even though what they're actually protesting has nothing to do with that agenda. In fact, it's the opposite. The bailouts occurred because we have too much government, not because we have too little. If we had limited government, there would be no bailouts. Anyway, let's continue this conversation. It's quite interesting. Cut number 9.
Corporations, unfettered capitalism, as Karl Marx understood, is a revolutionary force. It commodifies everything, human beings, the natural world, which it exploits for profit until exhaustion or collapse. And the bottom line is we don't have much time left. We are on the cusp of perhaps another major banking crisis in Europe. Defaults in Greece, followed by Spain, Portugal. There's been no restrictions, no regulations of Wall Street. They've looted the U.S. Treasury. They've played all the games that they were playing before. And we're about to pay for it all over again.
So he is equating unfettered capitalism with what we have right now. Well, under unfettered capitalism, how do you have corporate bailouts? Unfettered capitalism means companies fail. Right? So bailouts, government propping up insolvent and faltering institutions is not unfettered capitalism. It is the exact opposite of unfettered capitalism. If capitalism was unfettered, businesses would be allowed to fail. That's capitalism. Capitalism just, it's not just about private gain and socialized losses. It's about private losses as well. It doesn't work if you're trying to play it halfway. But look what else he's saying. He's saying there's been no restrictions, no regulation on Wall Street. None. What is he talking about? Does he have any idea how many rules and regulations are corrupting Wall Street? I mean, it is one of the most highly regulated areas of our economy. I know. I operate under all those rules and regulations. It's a maze. He probably couldn't even possibly understand. I can't even understand it. It took me almost 3 years to get permission to grow my business and hire people because of all the rules and regulations that are out there. They're hard to understand. They're expensive to comply with. To say that we have unfettered capitalism, that we have no regulations, that we have no restrictions, that's the exact opposite of what we have. Anyway, I'm going to continue to discuss this and take your calls when we come back. This is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com.
We know
The Peter Schiff Show.
which way you're going.
To President Obama, Secretary Geithner, Madam Pelosi, and all of the socialist econ professors across America. We're sorry. Peter Schiff is back on the air.
And this is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com, broadcasting live from Toronto, Canada, the headquarters of Europac Canada. And before we go back to the phones, I know we have a full board. I want to just play a little bit more sound from this discussion with New York Times reporter. And, he's clearly, he's blaming our problems on unfettered capitalism, on a complete absence of regulations and restrictions, when the exact opposite is true. We have anything but unfettered capitalism. We have corporatism, crony capitalism. The government is writing all the rules and regulations, and the government, not the market, is allocating capital, determining risk reward. That is the exact antithesis of what this individual claims to be against. But anyway, here is the final piece here. Notice how this is where the CBS guy interviewing him actually begins to challenge the New York Times reporter. And listen to that exchange. It's cut number 10.
Don't take this the wrong way, but you sound like a left-wing nutbar. If you want to shut down every corporation, every bank, where are you going to get a job? Where are you going to work? Where's the economy going to go?
Corporations don't produce anything. And
oh, really?
No. Financial corporations on Wall Street.
Are you driving a car to the protest?
No. They are speculators. I'm talking about the financial institutions like Goldman Sachs. They don't manufacture. They don't make anything. They gamble. They use money, and they believe falsely that money is real as we dismantle our manufacturing base.
So now you have it. See, it's not corporations that he's protesting. He wants to talk about corporations, but he's really speaking about financial institutions in bed with the U.S. government. He's really talking about companies like Goldman Sachs. And in a free market economy, the investment banks would serve a useful purpose. They would help put capital together with businesses that need it. Goldman Sachs, in a capitalistic economy without all this government intervention, would be helping to raise money for corporations that were manufacturing. Goldman Sachs would help companies raise money to build factories, to produce things. The reason that Goldman Sachs is not doing that, the reason that Goldman Sachs is simply speculating, is because of the government, because of the Federal Reserve, because of the cheap money being fed to Goldman Sachs by the central bank. Now, why is that? Is that the fault of capitalism? Is that the fault of corporations? No. That is the fault of the big government, which I'm sure this individual is very much in favor of. If we moved away from big government, then all of this activity would come to an end. It is all being financed through the banks. And why is the government doing this? The government is propping up the banks so it can maintain this phony economy of deficit spending on the part of the government and individuals. The government is spending borrowed money. Americans are spending borrowed money. This whole phony government-engineered economy is based on debt, on credit. And at the very center of that is the banks. But the government has corrupted the banking institutions and turned them into the very creatures that this New York Times reporter, Chris Hedges, is against. But he's using that. He's using the problems at the banks that the government created to try to further his Marxist agenda, his socialist agenda, but he's trying to paint the entire capitalistic system with that Goldman Sachs brush. But at the very root of this is government, right? The very policies which he is going to be in favor of are the ones that created the monster that is now destroying the economy and that he is protesting. So it's important to really understand where these protesters, many of them, are coming from, and understanding that some of them are pursuing an agenda. They're using the crisis to try to advance that agenda, and others are just confused. They are upset. They just don't know who to be upset. They're upset at the wrong people. And then there are some people like this Captain Midnighter kid, who actually understands the problem. So it's not, it's not all the way that the conventional media may be covering it. You've got something for everybody going on. But the common denominator, I guess, for everybody is that the situation in the United States is bad and getting worse, as the numbers I mentioned earlier in the show reveal regarding the big decline in inflation-adjusted incomes. And, of course, the decline is even bigger because the real rate of inflation is higher than what the government admits to. And this is going to continue. And eventually these protests are going to turn violent. I'm convinced of that. Anyway, let me now go to the phones on hold. First is Justin calling from Detroit, Michigan. Justin, you're on. Is Justin there? I don't know what happened to Justin. Maybe he can call back. He had been hanging on the longest. But let me try going to Brian in Hoboken, New Jersey. Brian, welcome to the show.
Hey, Peter. Thanks for taking my call. I just wanted to add a point, in reference to this theme you've been talking about this morning. Look at America's reaction to the death of Steve Jobs. I mean, Steve Jobs was worth $8 to $9 billion, successful CEO of a large corporation, and Americans overall didn't react poorly to his career. In fact, they thank him for making their lives better. And I think the reason is because, the technology sector does not have nearly as much government intervention as Wall Street and the finance sectors. And so I think the Americans, on a subconscious level, do appreciate, people that can make it fairly and freely. And they just don't appreciate, when there's that crony capitalism and government intervention.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. There is no real public resentment at Steve Jobs' wealth. People did not begrudge him the money that he made because they could see the results of his greed in the products that they had. I mean, I'm sure almost all these protesters who are there occupying Wall Street are keeping in touch with their friends on their iPhones. And their lives have been improved immeasurably for the better based on the greed of Steve Jobs. And so they see that and they don't resent it. But when the government comes in, when people are making money because of special privileges from government, I mean, very few people can see, what benefits Goldman Sachs has on the lives of typical Americans the way you can obviously see it with a Steve Jobs.
Thanks for taking my call.
Yeah, and what people have to know is, if you destroy the incentives of a free market system, you don't get a Steve Jobs. You don't have somebody producing. If Steve Jobs were born in a communist country and he stayed there, he wouldn't have invented anything. Do you think some communist dictator could have spotted Steve Jobs among all the other communist citizens and think he could have been assigned the job of inventing stuff? And do you think he would have invented anything if he was simply ordered to do it by some government bureaucrat? His talents, his ingenuity would have been wasted. It was only because he grew up in a free country, or at least a partially free country, that the world was able to benefit from his creativity and his ingenuity. And if we stifle that in the future, then the world is going to suffer immeasurably. Anyway, let me go to the next caller, Tim, calling from Chicago. Tim, welcome to the show.
Hi, Peter. Is it possible for people to just wish the dollar to hold its value throughout all this? It seems so much a matter of confidence since there's not paper bags of money in the street like Zimbabwe. Could we wish our way through this just by wanting the dollar to be valuable?
Well, it is a confidence game. I mean, that's the only thing that gives the dollar value temporarily is the confidence that the world places in it. I think the confidence is misplaced. It doesn't make any sense to me that there is confidence in the dollar. But, the problem is so many other currencies are flawed that to some, by comparison, the dollar looks sound, even though it's not. But, since the dollar has the role as the reserve currency, it kind of gets to be sound. It's looked at as a port in the storm, even though it's in the eye of the hurricane. And the key is going to be, when that storm moves, the people who are basking in the eye are going to be in for a rude awakening. But so can we continue this indefinitely? In answer to your question, no. Temporarily, yes. The dollar is not collapsing because of perception, but perception can change very quickly. And when perception matches reality, look out below. Anyway, that's it. I don't know if you have a follow-up. If you want to hang on, we've got a break coming up. We will be right back. You're listening to The Peter Schiff Show on SchiffRadio.com.
The Peter Schiff Show. now return to the Peter Schiff Show.
Call in now, 855-4-SCHIFF.
That's 855-472-4433.
Rebel Radio, the Peter Schiff Show.
And we are back, and this is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com. Going back to the telephones now, Ian in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Ian, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show.
Hey, Pete. Thanks for taking my call. I just wanted to get back to this relationship between banking and government, and you seem to draw such a clear line between the banks and the government. And I'm just wondering, on what basis do you make that distinction? Because it seems to me like so many of these people in government that are pushing these insane policies are either banking veterans themselves or, tied in with the banking establishment.
Yeah, well, remember, the government and the banks are in bed together, so to speak. Remember, the government guarantees all the bank accounts, so that they don't do that in other industries. They do it in brokerage as well, but a lot of, of course, the brokerage community and the banks are all tied in together. So the government has already hitched its wagon to the banking sector. And so once you come in and guarantee all the bank accounts, then you have all sorts of rules and regulations that the government has to put in place because they've now guaranteed the bank accounts. And then, of course, you've also got the situation where we're running enormous budget deficits, which means the government is beholden to the banking sector because the government has to finance these debts. So we've created a situation with these perpetual deficits where the government's interests and the banking interests in many cases go hand in hand because the government is the borrower and the banks are the lenders. And so, they're working in cooperation with one another, and it is resulting in tremendous problems for the overall economy.
Who would you say is the beneficiary of that transaction when the government borrows money from banks? Aren't the banks just as much of a beneficiary as the government is?
Well, yeah, the banks are getting paid interest from the government, and they're loaning money on what is perceived to be a risk-free basis because the government is going to pay the banks back because the government can tax or print to do it. So, yes, I mean, the banks make a lot of money off this relationship with government, but at whose loss? I mean, at the expense of the overall economy. I mean, this New York Times reporter is right to point out that much of what is happening on Wall Street is sheer speculation, that there is no real wealth being created at these banks. Wealth is being redistributed and siphoned away from the rest of the economy. But what is the enabling force that is allowing all this to happen? It is government. It is the government that is borrowing all the money. It's the Federal Reserve that's printing all the money. It's the Fed that's keeping interest rates artificially low. And it's the U.S. government that is writing all the rules that are regulating all these banks.
Now, if we could agree that maybe there had been some crime on, at some level on Wall Street, and we could prove that, assuming that there was a crime. Now, imagine we have like a small town and there's a murder. But, the police say, well, the way it is right now, we can't solve it. We can't do anything about this murder. And what you're saying is right. We should blame that government for not being able to solve the murder, but you don't want to completely absolve the person who actually pulled the trigger, do you?
Yeah, no. And think of our economy that has been, perpetuated. Everything is bought with debt. People borrow money to do everything. You want to buy a car, you get a loan. You want to buy furniture, you get a loan. Think about all these, you go into all these stores and they want to sell something. And they always have, no payments, no interest until 2013 or until 2014. How is all this possible? This is all done through the banking sector. All of these merchants are selling their receivables to Wall Street that securitizes them, collaterals them, issues debt against them. I mean, why is every single purchase have to be a banking transaction? I mean, once upon a time, Americans bought things out of savings. The banks were not involved in these transactions. Banks were involved in financing businesses, in financing big capital investments. The only time an American might have accessed a bank was to get a home mortgage, right, to buy a house. You didn't use bank credit to buy a vacuum cleaner, to buy, a sofa, to buy a refrigerator, to buy, a car, to buy. But now it's used for everything. The banks are involved in just about every transaction that takes place. You know, even smaller transactions. Now, people are going to the supermarket and buying groceries on credit, using a credit card.
One more quick question right along that line. And, you know, you may not like the way the question's phrased or not, but I'm just going to say it. Is usury a legitimate economic practice?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by that. I mean, there are usury laws that make it illegal to charge above a certain rate of interest. I don't believe
usury as a fee for the use of money to charge people.
No, there is nothing immoral about charging interest when somebody borrows money. We need interest to properly price loans. But the problem is we don't have a market rate of interest. We have interest rates being set by government decree. The government is not allowing market forces to determine interest rates. The government is doing that, and the government is setting interest rates too low, and that is damaging the economy immeasurably.
Isn't there a difference between a loan of money that already exists and credit, which is created out of nothing? How can you charge interest on something?
No, I mean, no, well, you're talking about the government creating money out of thin air. I mean, credit loans, they're still the same thing. But, yes, we do not want credit to come into existence out of thin air the way the Federal Reserve does it. Credit needs to come legitimately from savings, from resources that are not consumed, from underconsumption. That's where we want our credit to flow, not from a government printing press. That is the problem. We don't have a legitimate monetary system with legitimate banking, legitimate savings, legitimate credit. We have a government-created substitute that does not work, and we are experiencing the consequences. We are living through the consequences of this fiat monetary system, and I believe it is coming to an end, and the death is not going to be without a struggle and without a lot of pain, but I think this system will die nonetheless. The question is, what is going to replace it? Hopefully it will be the same system that existed prior to this monumental failure of an experiment, which really began about 40 years ago when Nixon, temporarily brought us off the gold standard. It's been 4 years. It's the temporary situation has persisted almost my entire life. I think it's about time we brought an end to it. But anyway, thank you for the call. I've got another local call now. So Bob calling from Toronto. Bob, welcome to the show.
Hey, what's up? Hi.
Bob, you're on.
So who owns the Federal Reserve?
Well, I mean, the Federal Reserve technically is private, and it's owned by the member banks. But, for all practical purposes, the Federal Reserve operates like a government department or a government agency, even though it's not supposed to be. But practically speaking, that's basically how it operates.
You don't exactly know who owns them?
Well, the banks own them, the member banks, and but it's it's a bank syndicate, and the syndicate are the banks, the Federal Reserve banks, who are members of the Fed.
Well, which
they're the shareholders.
Huh?
They're the major money center banks. I mean, they're the big banks, and the Federal Reserve is structured like a corporation, except that the Federal Reserve has to pay a tax equal to 100% of its profits above a certain amount to the U.S. Treasury. So it is a corporation. It generates a profit, but then it turns that profit over to the government. But it is allowed a small return on assets. But that's also one of the reasons that the Federal Reserve is so profligate with its money, because it will spend money on its buildings or on things very extravagantly, because whatever money is not spent is simply turned over to the government. So there's an incentive to if you go to Washington D.C. and take a look at the Federal Reserve building and look at how look at all that marble, look at how ornate it is. That's the reason. They spare no expense, because whatever is spared has to be turned over to the government. So they spend it on an extravagant building.
Yeah, but how do it start? I mean, somebody had to start it, right?
It was started by an act of Congress in 1913. That's what created it. But some people look at the fact that it's private and they think, somebody is getting rich off of it. I mean, yeah, the banks are making a lot of money, the whole banking sector, but it's not like there's somebody behind the curtain who's cashing all these dividend checks from the Federal Reserve. That's just not happening. I mean, the profits are going over to the government. Although they recently passed, a law or whatever it was, where now that the losses are going to go to Congress instead of the Fed, because pretty soon when interest rates start to rise and the Fed starts losing a fortune on the assets that it bought up after the financial crisis, instead of turning over profits to the U.S. Treasury, they're going to be turning over huge losses.
But it doesn't make sense to me. So just a bunch of congressmen, you said, got together and just started up?
Well, it wasn't just a bunch of congressmen. The president, approved it. And, of course, the president who signed the Federal Reserve Act, Woodrow Wilson, ultimately said it was his biggest mistake, that he regretted doing it, and he really, he felt bad that he had unleashed this entity on the U.S. And, of course, at the same time we got the Federal Reserve, we also got the income tax. The 13th Amendment was also passed. So, they're not related. Many people have a conspiratorial theory, think that the two were somehow related and they were dovetailed, but they were not related, but just coincidentally, it was a very bad time in American history. We got the Federal Reserve and the income tax at the same time, and we're now suffering as a result of both. And if we can get rid of both, that would be a big step in the right direction. Although in the immediate future, if we can simply rein in the Fed and dramatically reduce the income tax, in fact, we probably have a better chance of getting rid of the income tax than the Fed. But ultimately, it'd be good if we can get rid of both. But anyway, we will be back. This is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com.
Loving you, baby child.
The Peter Schiff Show. Peter Schiff Show was last on the air. The national debt added another $7.89 million.
Luckily, Peter's intelligence is growing twice as fast.
That's incredible.
Welcome back to your source of sanity in an insane world. It's the Peter Schiff Show.
This is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com. We've got the final segment of the Peter Schiff Show. We're still taking your calls. We've got a presidential debate coming on later this evening. It starts at 8 o'clock. This one is going to focus squarely or solely on the economy. I guess no foreign policy. It's hosted by Bloomberg TV and the Washington Post. A lot of the media attention now is being focused on Herman Cain, who is considered to be now one of the front runners by the media. I suppose it's better that they're focusing attention on Cain rather than all of it on Mitt Romney or Rick Perry. Now we got to see if the media can turn some of that attention onto Ron Paul. Again, unfortunately, absent from this debate will be Gary Johnson. He made it into that last Fox debate, but Bloomberg decided to exclude him, despite the fact that he'd be polling as high as a couple of the other people who Bloomberg decided to include in this debate. But I think Ron Paul really has to try to stand out on the economy. This should be a very, very strong issue for Ron Paul. He should have a lot more credibility on the economy than any of his other opponents in this race. And so I think if we can step away from a lot of the foreign policy issues, which generally result in more controversy in a Republican audience, this should be a debate which he would be able to win. Hopefully he is able to do that and get some more media attention. Because, look, the media is always looking for a new candidate to cover. And, he needs to get some more coverage. Also, the media is talking about Rick Perry. There is a lot of focus on Rick Perry, mainly because of how poorly he did in the last debate. So the pressure is on Rick Perry to try to put on a much, much stronger showing today. Based on the very poor showing he did before. So the attention is on Rick Perry for how poorly he did in the last debate, and it is on Herman Cain based on how well he did in that last debate. And other polls, he did manage to come in second in the value a straw poll. Of course, Ron Paul won. I've got an interesting sound clip too on that because they interviewed. I think this is on a CNN. Interviewed the guy that ran that value poll, who immediately tried to discredit his own poll by saying that the results really didn't mean anything because the wrong guy won. I've got that sound here somewhere. I don't know why I'm all of a sudden not finding it. If you can remember what that clip is, I don't know. I had that sound, but I'm going to have to go without it because I cannot find it. I had a pile of papers in front of me, and so I do not know what I did with it. But anyway, so it'll be very interesting to watch this debate. Now, I'm not sure if it's on Bloomberg television or not, or if they're actually showing it. I know it's sponsored by Bloomberg because I don't know if a lot of people even know where Bloomberg is on their sets. It's a rather obscure financial network. I mean, I know a lot of the Wall Street traders may be familiar with where Bloomberg is on their cable dial, but a lot of typical Republican voters may have never watched Bloomberg television before. So I'm not sure if the debate is only televised on Bloomberg or if they've got a deal with another network or something like that where the debate is going to be seen. So the problem with the debate, even if Ron Paul does manage to do exceptionally well, is not that many people will actually see it, and so they are going to be relying on media account of that debate. I don't know where the information keeps on coming from. Now, somebody just handed me a piece of paper, but this is not the sound that I was looking for. So again, it's not on this. I remember I saw it earlier. It was I don't know why I can't find it again. But I'm going to try to watch that debate here from Canada. And if for some reason I'm not able to do it, I'm not even sure if the feed will come into my hotel room. But hopefully some of the people who watch it, we can call in and discuss it tomorrow, because I do think it is going to be an opportunity for Ron Paul to try to steal a little bit of that spotlight, because now that we have we've moved from Perry or from Romney to Perry to Kaine. Obviously, the media is searching for a candidate to cover, and this might be an opportunity for Ron Paul to really focus on the economy and his track record. Because when he ran for president in 2008, he was the only candidate that understood the problems in the economy. He was talking about these problems in 2007 before it blew up. He was talking about the coming financial crisis, the housing crisis, when guys like Romney, and I wish Ron Paul could get some of these old Romney quotes, because Romney was cheerleading the economy. Romney was talking about how good the economy was under George Bush, when Ron Paul was rightly criticizing the problems under the Bush administration. So Romney was clueless, and he's out here campaigning as this expert on the economy. He's from Wall Street. He's got the experience. Yet when he ran for president in 2007, when he was in a primary, in front of the greatest economic crisis, the greatest economic collapse since the Great Depression, this guy that supposedly is so solid on the economy was as clueless as anybody else. He had no idea that anything of this nature was coming, and there were all kinds of debate clips of Romney making those types of claims, how solid the economy was, and how I remember the debates, because Ron Paul was in debates with Romney. We could find some of the old sound, because when Ron Paul brought up some of these points, Romney was there to dismiss them, saying that Ron Paul's concerns were wrong, that the economy was in good shape. Those are some of the clips that we need to dig up, and if the Ron Paul camp can find some of them, and maybe he'd have a chance to challenge Romney on his prior, misdiagnosis of the U.S. economy, and to question, if he couldn't understand the nature of the problems back then, how was he expected to solve the problems when he was so blindsided and so clueless about them just a few short years ago? Anyway, that would be a very interesting debate and discussion should it actually come up. So I'll be watching for that. Anyway, just real quickly, we'll see what happens with the markets here. All of the indexes are now finishing the show in the positive. The Dow is finally up about 7 points. However, we still can't seem to get a rise out of the commodities. Although, nope, silver, on the other hand, has totally recovered its early morning losses. Silver is now positive, so we seem we've got a pretty good reversal going on. We'll see what happens later in the day if the dollar can reverse and have another down session. It's still positive on the day, but it seems like it's on the lows of the day, even though it's still positive. Again, I will be back again tomorrow with another full episode of the Peter Schiff Show coming from Toronto en route to Montreal, so don't forget to tune in. This has been Peter Schiff on SchiffRadio.com, the gold standard in talk radio.
Made me a song like Sister Studio. That's studio. He said, how about more like Watch Out Now by the Beat Nuts.
The Peter Schiff Show.